Yeah, so I'm at Microsoft. I work in the CTO's office. I run an internal venture studio for Microsoft. We look for kind of big strategic bets all over the... Carried around? Okay. Awesome. Oh, there we go. We're a big strategic bet factory for Microsoft. We look for things that are going to be a big business for Microsoft some 5 to 7 years out. We work entirely internally, kind of taking projects or people or teams or ideas and growing them like a startup within our program, ideally launching them any die along the way as businesses for Microsoft in years to come. Prior to this, I worked in venture capital. I was a B2B SaaS founder. I've been kind of in the startup ecosystem for a while. The goal of this talk is really to outline the whole of the corporate venture ecosystem, how all of the different players play together in coming up with innovative ideas and innovative companies, and how to interact as a player. All of us, and in the end, in my mind, as innovative startup people, eventually kind of work with corporates, the big behemoths of the world, either enterprises or governments, in order to get an exit for our startup or push our ventures to the next level. And this outlines a little map of how to think about that. Feel free to stop me at any time along the way, raise a hand, all that sort of thing. So this is what my program does. We start with ideas, we move to prototypes, we turn those into incubations, which are little teeny tiny companies. We grow those teeny tiny companies and then launch them as businesses for Microsoft in different verticals. That slide did not quite, there we go, okay. A little bit in terminology here. We hear the terms incubator, accelerator, kind of venture studio used in a variety of different ways. I'm going to normalize it a little bit here. Incubators provide the space for idea generation, kind of starting at that 0 point when you're around the room brainstorming something new, all of the post-it notes going up on the wall. Your sole goal in this stage is get from 0 to 1. Accelerators, on the other hand, kind of take those things that have a bit of product market fit and they scale them from 1 to 100. That's kind of the two spaces in which incubators and accelerators work. These terms are used differently in other places, but this is kind of a standard, I think 80% of people kind of agree on these terms. A venture studio does both. They work both with ideas at the very early stages, generally with a core central team, but also with startups and turning things into startups as they grow. So I'm not certain entirely what's happening with my slide here. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. So the idea to prototype stage consists of two really distinct and different activities. The first is the idea generation stage. This is a stage that a lot of people really get excited about. They love coming into a session and being off the wall and wild and coming up with these creative ideas. You often, will hire in a consultant person with a design thinking background, and there'll be these pretty colors, and you'll work in Miro or other visual design tools in order to really come up with these different ideas and put them everywhere. That's a vital, important stage. Vital, important stage, don't get me wrong. It can be tainted sometimes, too, when you have people coming in and as you're coming up with the ideas, they're trying to evaluate them in some way. The problem with that is that we're using two very different internal mental mechanisms to first do the generation and then do the validation. So it's important when you're working at those early stages, both inside your own startup, inside your own company, that you separate the idea generation, which is the woolly side, which is where volume is the only measure of return on investment, from the idea of validation side. Once you've done that discrete activity of coming up with all of these ideas, and you can do this on a daily basis, or it can be like a once-a-year workshop that you run, or anything along those lines, shifting to the idea of validation is where you go through a rigorous experimental process of taking each of those ideas that you've come up with, or each of the things that you're testing out around a particular startup or a prototype, and validating that with the customer or with the technologist to see if it's a feasible technology path. Incubators and venture studios experiment with these and apply that own experimentation to their process of coming up with the 0 to 1 in order to get to that product market fit. Now, incubation to launch, they expand the experiment set on what they're working on. So product market fit is where you think you have something that the customer is really interested in. You think that there's some trajectory you have for your particular incubation there. Now it's time to layer over all of the testing that you have to do in terms of business model, in terms of team composition in order to drive this forward. How do you scale? Does putting a lot of money into this venture now make sense? Do you have a scaling path to go forward? This also, if you're doing this internally, like a program of mine, this is also where you start laying the groundwork for launching it into one of your already existing business units, depending on the size of your company. Okay, there's two kind of aspects to doing it inside the corporation, though. There's business value not only in the ventures being launched, but also in the elevation of the company's own internal processes for doing innovation, and as a cultural enrichment tool for ensuring that your employees, your management, feels like they can take ideas to a place where they don't just get stuck as a post-it note on a wall or on a mural board that gets archived, but in something that takes the idea forward in a substantive way, run through a rigorous process so they can say at the end, oh yes, my idea died because the process proves that it can die, that it needed to die. Or my idea thrived because the process helped show that my idea can thrive. Being able to take those things forward is a huge cultural empowerment tool for innovation within companies of any size. But it's important that you have both aspects. You can take the validation to extreme and not have any innovation come out of your company as a result because it's immediately put into a meat grinder. Or you can have the hand-wavy innovation where everybody comes up with those, again, those post-it notes. I use them all the time, don't get me wrong, I love post-it notes, but where they just remain post-it notes and they don't turn into business value for your company. As you build these ventures internally, if you're, this can happen as a joint venture too, if you're a kind of an SMB working with a corporate partner or an SMB working with another SMB. The process to launch that idea, especially later stage in your own corporation, ends up having a lot of similarity to bringing in a startup of a similar size into your enterprise or your medium-sized business. What we've seen success in is actually having those two functions learn from each other in terms of both setting up the internal venture, small venture that you're hoping to land in some product group or in another part of the company with your M&A acquisition process so that you can collaborate on the operational sides of things and drive a lot of interesting learnings both from a cultural standpoint and from making that whole process easier for both outside companies coming in and inside companies moving elsewhere. Okay, so we've been talking so far about corporate, internal kind of corporate incubators and accelerators. Where does corporate venture capital fit into all of this? What's the function of corporate venture capital in that space? So corporate venture capital, our Microsoft is called M12. It's a venture capital firm associated with a corporation. There's kind of two, maybe three different models that these corporate venture capital firms can serve. One is, and this is probably the smallest way in which they serve, is a hedge. So it's possible, right, that there's a couple of different acquisition targets that Microsoft might have around a certain sort of technology. In theory, we can't invest in all of them. We can't incorporate all of them. So there might be a technology, we're pretty sure that, I don't know, crypto isn't going to go somewhere soon. But we might be wrong. So we're going to invest in some crypto firms as a hedge. If they do get big, we'll still be able to get value out of that place on the cap table. And that this is theoretical. I'm not involved in those decision makings. Two is a way of running parallel bets. So I could be developing something internally that I think I have a good team around. I think I have a good trajectory, a good path for. But also, it might be that startup has a better one. And so I'm going to invest in that effort as well, because this thing is so strategic for my company's direction that I gotta win it. And so I'm just going to make bets in both places. The third one can often be a kind of a way, almost a pre-vetting of an M&A acquisition, where you join in the company's early life cycle, you invest in that company as it's going through its growth stages, and at a certain point it might be an attractive addition to the company as an M&A acquisition. Now, put yourself on the other side. You're a startup, and you're courted by M12, or maybe you've been courting M12, or how should you think about that relationship? It's a different sort of thing, right? Are they betting on me as a hedge? Am I going to be acquired by Microsoft at some point in time? Any relationship that a startup has with a larger corporation, the founders kind of need to think through in a really solid way how the different speeds of the two different entities operate, and how it fits into their longer-term strategic goals as a startup. A little bit more on that later, assuming my slide survived. Oh, this is my favorite. So outside air. There are some kinds of ideas that are difficult to do as an enterprise. Often they have to do with have a lot to do with risk. This is where partnering with outside venture studios, accelerators, and incubators can be a really fruitful path for driving innovation. For example, as a corporate, you could reach out to a venture studio like Pioneer Square Labs or Mach 49 or venture studios along those lines and say, hey, there's a set of things that I want to innovate in. I'm already doing some internally. Don't worry about that there. But there's a different way in which I want to approach it. Because of what we call the corporate tax of doing innovation internally, things have to be super compliant. Things have to be at a relatively low level of risk internally, because if you're a startup on the outside and you do something wrong, well, you can just fold, and the problem kind of ends there. Microsoft doesn't have that possibility, right? There's always going to be something there if the venture doesn't go the right direction. But this is also a great way of kind of getting some outside air into your own innovation process when you partner with these outside accelerators or venture studios. The best model that we've seen in these kinds of partnerships is when the corporate and the venture studio both take the startup as the first order of business. And what I mean by that is they are there for the success of the startup, not necessarily a joint venture collaboratively. What that means is that the corporate will contribute generally some funding to cover the work of the venture studio for a period of time, and often some headcount too for some of the innovators that they have inside who they want to have exposure to this outside air. And they'll come up with a bunch of startups, and they'll run it through the venture studio's own process, and those startups will become startups out in the world. The corporate may have an option to acquire at a certain stage in the company's life cycle as a result of the founding of the company. But it's important that the founder of that company, even inside the venture studio, has the ability to run with it as a venture-funded company so that it operates with the same kinds of mechanics that both the venture studio and the corporate are hoping for in being like a true startup. This is also a great way of retaining talent inside the corporation if you're able to form a partnership like this, where your entrepreneurial talent who might have come in on an acquisition a couple of years ago and they've done their time incorporating the acquisition and they're now getting itchy feet. This is a great way of rolling them into a very innovative process where they already have proven that they can sell their startup into a corporation, and they're able to have a little bit of fun on the outside, if that makes sense. Okay, experimental partnerships. Oh man, these are really interesting. This is a place where startups, we do a lot of work with startups, and it's a complicated one. There's a couple of different things to consider here. There's a symbiosis here that you have to take care to respect in both sides of the relationship. The corporate often is very interested in understanding how this startup will use their technology in order to prove out the case for a whole bunch of different startups and other companies that the corporate is interested in working with. And that's great. The startup is interested in the money that the corporate has and being able to develop out on their platform. The thing you have to take care of here on both sides of the equation is that For example, the corporation might just routinely bill in 90-day increments, and the startup could die within those 90 days as a result of just the way the billing is set up. And so it's, as a corporate, it's important that you approach that relationship from a respect on the operational side with the startup that you're working with. Yes, you're big and you have your processes and things, but you're going to miss out on important strategic relationships if you aren't able to kind of just solve those operational things in a light way for the startups that you're working with. As a startup, it's really important to understand the heaviness of the operational side of any corporate that you're going to be working with, particularly from a cash flow perspective. Yeah, I think that's all on that one. Yep. Man, I'm missing. Okay. The thing that I want to have everyone kind of come away with from this particular session, then we can do some Q&A, is the role of the founder throughout all of these different relationships. There's the very best startup ideas has three things in common. There's something the founders themselves want, that they themselves can build, and that few others realize are worth doing. So what if we thought about this model from the perspective of a founder coming first? And this kind of helps tie the whole relationship between the sets of entities in these sorts of conversations together. What if, in order to make my company more innovative, I gave certain kinds of innovators or certain kinds of performers a week off once a year where they're just supposed to come up with fun ideas? What if I'm a big corporation and I have some sort of benchmark similar to a sabbatical, or maybe it's a certain kind of leader who wants to go try a startup on the outside? What if I funded their healthcare for a year while they went and did that, knowing that chances are their startup will fail because the vast majority of startups fail, but the learnings that they're able to get as part of that are hugely helpful for me as a corporate in terms of training them, in terms of working with them, and bringing them back in as a boomerang, which often happens already anyway. What too if we were able to set up these, had the relationships with these venture studios where it was almost a rolling door model, where certain people from our company have the opportunity to do a tour of duty at the venture studio, learning those kinds of innovation processes, maybe leaving with a company inside the venture studio, just doing their 3, 6, 9-month stint, but then coming back into the corporation for another tour of duty inside their regular role. It's an incredibly hands-on way of training up your innovation talent force, and also one that I think is going to be increasingly growing, particularly with the ease of starting startups in the age of generative AI, where you can start a startup with very little capital and grow it to a very high ROI in a short period of time. So what do you currently do with people who have ideas inside your company? Do they feel like they can talk about them? Do they feel like they need to keep it safe so that they can go outside and do it on their own? Do innovative ideas only come within certain periods inside your companies? What's your mechanisms for handling those? Do you have validation mechanisms where employees know where they can take their idea and kind of run it through a system or a process or a way of understanding if it's good or not? What do those look like? Do you have places where there's ideas coming out and they live on a bulletin board somewhere that some other part of your company should be taking advantage of, but they're not aware of them? How do you make that routing mechanism across different parts of your business? What does that look like? Using this kind of corporate venture ecosystem mindset. Allows you to apply it at any layer of scale inside a small business, inside a medium-sized business, inside an enterprise, of how you should relate the different sorts of ways of running experiments, big ones in the CTO's office, or small partnerships with a startup who's doing something cool that might benefit a platform at some point in time. Using that as a microcosm for whatever size of organization that you're working in or have charge of, allows you to see how those different kinds of experiments can be run in different ways, shows you how the ideas can move between them in important ways, and most importantly, helps you identify a way of freeing the people who have those attributes of wanting to solve the problem, having the capability of building it, and allowing them to move forward. And that's all I have. But happy to take any questions. I think I had another 3 minutes of slides in there, but they went the way of the ghost. Yeah.
Is Microsoft doing all of the different versions?
Yes.
Are you participating in all of them as well?
Yes.
How does the innovation and incubation for startup ventures and connection to nonprofits does Microsoft support a cohesive?
Yes. For us, startups are startups, regardless of whether they're profit or a nonprofit. There's a slightly different storytelling perspective on that score, because we find for nonprofits that the storytelling is much more important and vital. But otherwise, from our perspective, they're serving customers, they have a value proposition, and that's something that Microsoft wants to help empower.
Great. Thank you.
Do you have an example of a product that's come to market that started through that internal entrepreneur?
Yes. Yeah, so we had two people on a team that were coming up with had come up with a fun solution for generating synthetic data. It made no sense on their team, none at all. Their team was planning on cutting it because it wasn't on their product roadmap, and they were right to do so, right? They applied to our central incubator. We saw the value of synthetic data in a different place inside the company because of that kind of idea routing mechanism. Over the course of about 3 months, we worked with them to build their value proposition, very much like a seed stage startup would. And we pitched that value proposition in front of our capital allocators, and they became an incubation in our program funded with dollars and headcount. Another example, we had a individual with he had two co-conspirators who had come up with a fun sort of hardware visual product. Came to my incubator, and I said, well, we don't do that kind of thing. But I also run a consortium of all the other incubators and accelerators inside of Microsoft. So I reached out to my counterparts in the Surface org, and indeed, they were working on something that was adjacent, and so they started collaborating in that sort of fashion. This gets to kind of the ability to move the idea to the place where it will thrive the best, but you have to have that microfluidic mechanism to get the ideas moving around.
So I guess two questions. One is, if an internal employee of Microsoft says, hey, I've got an idea, and you guys help them to launch this out, what type of equity do you guys give the employee in said new company? Yeah, that's first question.
It varies with the program that the company is a part that the employee is a part of. So for my internal venture studio, there's no equity at all. In fact, it's very complicated to give equity-like things on project performance inside an engineering org, for example. Ends up having HR compensation problems, so that as far as equity across the company goes. Externally, it's really easy, right? Because you're able to set up an entity, the entity, and share out shares in that variety of ways. The value prop for the employee that comes up with an idea for my program is twofold. One is their idea wouldn't work outside of Microsoft. There are just some things that are that way. There are also many, many ideas that won't work inside Microsoft. And depending on what that is, the employee should either apply to a program like mine or leave and go do it in a much more fruitful way externally. And I want to incent both, because I don't want that employee to be sitting on that idea and being like, man, I wish I could have done that. Instead, here I am, this is fun work and all, pays the bills, but I want to go do that thing. I want to incent that because that value can be created out in the world, and they know, especially if they leave on great terms, like, hey, Microsoft took care of me. Microsoft is helping the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and I know I can go back there if that's the case. And I believe this scales for nearly any size of enterprise, except maybe the very earlier stage startups, 15-person teams. Because you want that, you don't want the regret in the back of the head, I think.
Awesome. And then that's great. Question number 2 is, what's your favorite form of validation or killing the baby,
Yeah, very small incremental experiments. So in enterprises, once you have a bunch of understanding around the customer problem, your user research team will want to kick off a 3-month study. Great, kick off a 3-month study. But in the next hour, what can you do to make you a little bit more certain or less certain about the direction in which a particular experiment you're running is going? Should the button be blue or yellow? Should the business model be SaaS or project-based? There are experiments you can run right now that will help guide whether you should take one direction or the other. Will you need to eventually become very quantitative? Yes, 100%, but not at the expense of moving. Because if you start running all the user experiments on the 1,000 ideas that you came up with in that nifty offsite that you did with all of your team, they'll die in the meantime. And so it's moving quickly with small iterative experiments. Yeah, I think I'm at time. Thank you.